He thought he was removing a problem from his restaurant that night, but what Daniel Brooks didn't realize was that he had just insulted the one woman who had the power to shut the entire place down without raising her voice. The Magnolia Room was the kind of restaurant people talked about weeks before they managed to get a reservation. Soft golden lights reflected off polished marble floors, crystal glasses shimmered under chandeliers, and the low hum of quiet conversation floated through the air like background music. Located in the heart of downtown, the restaurant sat on the ground floor of a historic 12-story building that overlooked the busiest avenue in the city. Most guests arrived in tailored jackets, elegant dresses, and expensive watches that glinted every time they lifted a glass. Daniel Brooks stood near the host stand, adjusting the cuff of his pressed navy suit while scanning the room with the careful attention of a man who believed he could judge a customer's value within seconds. 15 years in restaurant management had convinced him that appearances told the whole story. People who belonged here looked a certain way. People who didn't, well, they stood out immediately. At exactly 7:18 p.m., the glass door opened quietly and a woman stepped inside. Clara Whitmore paused just inside the entrance, brushing a bit of city dust from the sleeve of her simple grey coat. She carried a canvas tote bag over one shoulder and wore comfortable walking shoes that had clearly seen more sidewalks than red carpets. There was nothing flashy about her. No jewelry that caught the light, no designer logo announcing status, no hint that she had stepped out of a luxury car moments earlier. In fact, most of the guests barely noticed her at all. But Daniel noticed. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her from across the foyer. He had developed what he liked to call a professional instinct. After years of working in upscale dining rooms, he believed he could instantly recognize whether someone was truly a guest or simply someone who had wandered in by mistake. Clara approached the host stand with calm, unhurried steps, glancing around the room with a quiet curiosity that made it seem as if she were observing the place rather than trying to belong to it. The young hostess greeted her politely, though a faint uncertainty flickered across her face. "Good evening, Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" Clara smiled gently, the kind of calm smile that came from someone who had learned long ago not to rush conversations. "No reservation," she said. "But I was hoping there might be a small table available, perhaps near the window." The hostess hesitated, glancing toward the reservation screen. Before she could respond, Daniel stepped forward with smooth authority, inserting himself into the exchange the way managers often do when they believe a situation needs correction. His smile looked professional, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm afraid that won't be possible tonight," he said, his voice polite yet unmistakably firm. "The Magnolia Room operates strictly by reservation during dinner service." Clara nodded slightly, as if considering his words rather than reacting to them. "I understand," she replied calmly. "I thought I might ask anyway." Daniel studied her again, taking in the plain coat, the tote bag, the absence of any signal that she belonged among the city's wealthiest diners. Around them, the clinking of glasses and quiet laughter continued as if nothing unusual was happening. Yet something about the moment lingered in the air, subtle and unspoken. Because what Daniel Brooks believed was a simple refusal was actually the first move in a situation that would soon make the entire room fall silent. Clara Whitmore remained standing at the host stand for a moment, her calm expression unchanged even as Daniel Brooks subtly shifted his posture to signal that the conversation was already over. Around them, the Magnolia Room continued its quiet rhythm of luxury. Waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying plates arranged with careful precision, glasses chimed softly as guests toasted one another, and the soft glow of the chandeliers cast warm reflections across the polished marble floor. From the outside, nothing about the moment appeared unusual. Yet for Clara, the room held a quiet familiarity that no one else in the restaurant seemed to notice. She glanced toward the tall windows overlooking the avenue, where the evening traffic flowed steadily beneath rows of glowing streetlights. 12 stories above them, offices and apartments filled the historic building that had stood on this corner for more than 80 years. Most guests admired the architecture without ever thinking about who owned it. Clara, however, knew every hallway, every elevator shaft, every brick that formed the structure. Daniel cleared his throat gently, reminding her that he was still waiting for her to step aside. "As I mentioned, we are fully booked tonight," he said again, this time with a slightly sharper tone that suggested the discussion had reached its natural conclusion. The hostess shifted uncomfortably beside him, glancing from Clara to the reservation screen as though hoping a table might magically appear. Clara tilted her head slightly, her voice still soft. Are you certain there is nothing available? Even a small table for one? Daniel gave a short professional smile, the kind used to end conversations quickly. I am quite certain. At a nearby table, a couple paused their conversation long enough to glance toward the entrance. Moments like this often carried a quiet tension in upscale restaurants, the unspoken awareness that someone had walked into a place where they did not quite belong. Daniel had seen it countless times before. A curious visitor wandered in, asked hopeful questions, and then quietly left once they realized the prices on the menu alone were higher than most people expected. In his mind, the situation was already resolved. Perhaps another establishment nearby would be better suited this evening, he added politely, gesturing toward the door with an open hand. Clara followed the direction of his gesture, looking briefly at the entrance she had just walked through. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the darkening sky, and the steady sound of traffic drifted faintly through the glass doors. For a brief moment she seemed to consider his suggestion. Then she returned her attention to Daniel, studying his expression with quiet curiosity. You have worked here a long time, have you not? She asked. The question caught him slightly off guard. Nearly 15 years, he replied, straightening his shoulders with a hint of pride. I know this restaurant very well. Clara nodded slowly, as though that answer confirmed something she had already suspected. Her eyes moved across the dining room again, lingering on the elegant decor, the rows of tables filled with confident guests, the staff moving quickly under Daniel's supervision. Everything appeared perfectly controlled, exactly the way Daniel preferred it. That must mean you know this building well too, she said quietly. Daniel frowned slightly, uncertain why the building itself had entered the conversation. Of course, he answered. Anyone who manages a place like this understands the property. Clara gave a small thoughtful smile, the kind that suggested she knew something he did not. That is interesting, she said gently, adjusting the strap of her canvas bag. Because I have spent quite a bit of time learning about it myself. For the briefest moment, something about her tone made the air feel slightly different, though Daniel could not explain why. He dismissed the feeling almost immediately. To him, she was simply another visitor who had wandered into the wrong place. And with a calm nod of farewell, Clara Whitmore turned toward the door and quietly stepped back out into the evening city air. The evening air outside the restaurant felt cooler than Clara Whitmore expected, carrying the familiar sounds of the city settling into its nighttime rhythm. Cars moved steadily along the avenue, their headlights sliding across the polished glass of the historic building rising above her. She paused on the sidewalk for a moment, adjusting the strap of her canvas bag while glancing up toward the upper floors. 12 stories of offices, apartments, and businesses stood quietly above the elegant restaurant she had just left behind. Most people walking past would see nothing more than an old building surrounded by modern lights and busy traffic. But Clara saw something very different. She saw decades of careful restoration, thousands of hours of work preserving the structure, and a long series of decisions that had kept the building standing when other historic properties had been replaced by steel towers. For her, the building was not just real estate. It was a responsibility. Behind her, inside the Magnolia Room, the atmosphere quickly returned to normal once the door closed. Daniel Brooks watched the entrance for a few seconds, making sure the woman had actually left before turning back to the dining room. In his mind the interruption had been minor, hardly worth remembering. The hostess beside him exhaled quietly as if relieved the conversation had ended. She seemed polite, the young woman said cautiously. Daniel gave a small dismissive shrug. Polite does not always mean appropriate for the setting, he replied while smoothing the front of his suit jacket. This place has a reputation to maintain. The hostess nodded, though a faint uncertainty lingered in her expression. Daniel was already scanning the room again, returning to the constant calculation that filled his mind every evening. Which guests needed attention? Which tables required faster service? Which new arrivals might be important enough to impress? Experience had taught him that success in a place like this depended on maintaining a certain atmosphere. And that atmosphere depended on careful control of who walked through the door. Meanwhile outside, Clara began walking slowly along the sidewalk toward the corner of the building. The city lights reflected softly off the windows above her, and for a moment she paused near the main entrance to the tower itself. A brass plaque beside the revolving door displayed the building name in elegant lettering that had been polished countless times over the years. She reached out almost absent-mindedly, brushing a small speck of dust from the plaque as though tidying something that already belonged to her. At that same moment, a dark sedan turned onto the avenue and eased toward the curb in front of the building. The car slowed smoothly before coming to a quiet stop beneath the glow of a street lamp. Inside the Magnolia room, Daniel was speaking with a waiter about a table that had requested a specific wine when a subtle movement outside the front window caught the hostess's attention. Through the glass she could see the black sedan idling at the curb, its polished surface reflecting the restaurant lights. A man in a tailored suit stepped out of the passenger side and looked briefly up toward the towering building before turning his attention to the sidewalk. The hostess tilted her head slightly as she watched the scene. Something about the man's confident posture suggested he was not simply dropping someone off for dinner. He walked directly toward the entrance where Clara Whitmore now stood waiting beside the brass doors. Daniel barely noticed at first, continuing his conversation with the staff. But within a few seconds the suited man opened the rear door of the sedan and retrieved a slim leather briefcase before stepping onto the sidewalk beside Clara. From inside the restaurant, the hostess could not hear their words, but she could see the man greet her with unmistakable respect. Daniel glanced up briefly at the movement outside, then returned to the dining room, unaware that the quiet meeting happening only a few feet away was about to change everything he believed about the woman he had just sent away. The man who stepped out of the sedan moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously the moment he entered a room. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, and the polished leather briefcase in his hand caught the reflection of the streetlight as he approached Clara Whitmore. When he reached her, he offered a respectful nod before speaking. "Good evening, Ms. Whitmore," he said warmly. "I hope I did not keep you waiting." Clara gave a small reassuring smile. "Not at all, Ethan. I arrived only a few minutes ago." Ethan Caldwell adjusted his glasses and glanced briefly up at the tall building rising above them. "I reviewed the documents during the drive. Everything is ready for your signature whenever you wish to proceed." Clara looked toward the restaurant windows for a moment, where soft golden light still spilled out onto the sidewalk. Through the glass she could see silhouettes of diners enjoying their evening without any awareness of the quiet conversation happening outside. "That will not be necessary just yet," she said calmly. Ethan followed her gaze toward the restaurant and seemed to understand immediately that something unexpected had occurred. "Did something happen inside?" he asked carefully. Clara gave a small thoughtful pause before answering. "Nothing serious," she said gently. "Just a misunderstanding." Inside the Magnolia room, Daniel Brooks was making his rounds between the tables, ensuring everything remained perfectly controlled. The restaurant had regained its rhythm, and the brief interruption at the entrance had already faded from his thoughts. A waiter approached him quietly with a question about a special request from one of the guests. Daniel nodded while offering quick instructions, his attention fully absorbed in maintaining the evening's smooth operation. Near the front window, however, the hostess had not stopped watching the sidewalk. From her position behind the stand she could see the man in the suit speaking respectfully with the same woman who had just been turned away minutes earlier. Something about the interaction felt unusual. The man stood slightly to the side of Clara as though allowing her space while also clearly waiting for her direction. At one point he opened the briefcase and showed her a document, holding it carefully so she could read it beneath the street lamp. The hostess leaned slightly closer to the glass, curiosity beginning to replace the uncertainty she had felt earlier. Outside, Clara listened patiently as Ethan explained a few final details about the property paperwork he carried. "The structural inspection for the upper floors has already been approved," he said. "The tenants will receive the updated lease notices next week. Most of them should not have any issues with the renewal terms. Clara nodded thoughtfully. And the restaurant? Ethan closed the briefcase slowly. Their lease is also scheduled for review soon. The renewal discussion was planned for later this month. Clara glanced once more through the window toward the dining room. From this angle she could clearly see Daniel Brooks moving confidently between the tables, greeting guests and directing staff with the authority of someone who believed he fully understood his environment. Her expression remained calm, but there was a quiet meaning behind her gaze now. "That timing may prove interesting," she said softly. Ethan looked toward the restaurant as well, beginning to sense the deeper implication of her words. "Would you like me to arrange a meeting with their ownership group?" he asked. Clara considered the question for a moment before answering. "Perhaps," she said. "But not tonight." At that moment the hostess inside the restaurant stepped away from the stand and quietly approached Daniel. "Excuse me," she whispered. "You might want to look outside." Daniel frowned slightly, following her gesture toward the front window. Through the glass he saw the same woman he had just dismissed standing calmly beside a well-dressed man holding a briefcase. For a brief second the scene meant nothing to him. Then he noticed the way the man spoke to her with unmistakable deference, and something about that detail caused the smallest flicker of uncertainty to pass through his mind. Daniel Brooks stood near the front window longer than he intended, his eyes fixed on the quiet scene unfolding outside. From a distance the moment still seemed ordinary. A woman he had just turned away from the restaurant was speaking with a man in a well-tailored suit. Yet the more he watched, the more something about the interaction unsettled him. The man was not speaking to her like a stranger. He was not speaking to her like a client either. There was a subtle difference in his posture, a respectful attentiveness that Daniel recognized immediately from years of observing business meetings. The man with the briefcase was clearly the one waiting for direction. And that direction was coming from Clara Whitmore. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, trying to dismiss the thought forming in his mind. "It is probably nothing," he murmured under his breath. The hostess remained beside him, still watching through the glass doors. "He called her Ms. Whitmore," she said quietly. Daniel looked down at her with mild irritation. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Not exactly," she admitted. "But it looked like that is what he said." Outside on the sidewalk, Ethan Caldwell had opened his briefcase again. This time he carefully removed a folder and held it open so Clara could see the documents inside. Even from across the glass Daniel could recognize the crisp white paper and the familiar appearance of legal forms. Clara read something briefly before nodding once. The movement was small, but it carried the calm authority of someone making a final decision. Ethan immediately returned the document to the folder as if he had just received confirmation he had been waiting for. Inside the Magnolia room, Daniel felt a quiet tension begin to settle in the pit of his stomach. For the first time that evening he looked at the woman outside without the automatic judgment he had applied earlier. Her clothing was still simple, her posture still relaxed, yet the way the man listened to her suggested something very different from what Daniel had assumed. A waiter approached with a question about a table requesting dessert menus, but Daniel barely heard him. His attention remained fixed on the sidewalk. "I will handle it in a moment," he said absently before turning back toward the window. Outside, Clara closed the folder gently and handed it back to Ethan. "There is no need to rush the paperwork tonight," she said calmly. "The building has stood here for decades. One more week will not change anything." Ethan nodded respectfully. "Of course, Ms. Whitmore." The way he spoke her name carried the tone of someone addressing a person with authority. Clara glanced once more toward the restaurant windows, her eyes settling briefly on the elegant dining room inside. For a moment Daniel felt the strange sensation that she was looking directly at him, even though the distance and reflection made that impossible to confirm. Then Clara turned slightly toward the entrance of the tower beside the restaurant. The brass revolving doors reflected the glow of the streetlights as she stepped closer to them. Ethan moved to hold the door open for her, again with the quiet courtesy he had shown since arriving. Inside the restaurant, Daniel straightened suddenly. Something about the direction she was walking made his confusion deepen. The entrance she approached was not the restaurant door. It was the main entrance to the building itself. "Where is she going?" the hostess whispered. Daniel did not answer immediately. His eyes followed Clara as she stepped through the revolving doors beneath the polished brass plaque that displayed the building's name. For the first time that evening, Daniel Brooks realized that the brief encounter he had dismissed so quickly might not have been as simple as he thought. And although he could not yet explain why, a quiet sense of unease began to settle over him like a shadow that had just begun to grow. Daniel Brooks remained standing near the front window long after Clara Whitmore disappeared through the brass revolving doors of the tower entrance. The uneasy feeling in his chest had not faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. The Magnolia Room continued its elegant rhythm around him, but for the first time that evening Daniel found himself distracted by something he could not quite explain. He had spent 15 years managing upscale restaurants, learning to read people quickly and confidently. Yet the scene he had just witnessed did not match the judgment he had made earlier. The hostess beside him shifted nervously. "She went into the building," she said quietly, as though confirming something that had already become obvious. Daniel nodded slowly without taking his eyes off the doors. "Yes. I can see that." The young hostess hesitated before speaking again. "Most people who live or work in the tower use the side entrance after business hours." Daniel frowned slightly at that detail. The main lobby entrance was usually reserved for tenants, business executives, and scheduled visitors who belonged inside the building. It was not an entrance most casual pedestrians used without purpose. A waiter approached Daniel once more, politely reminding him that several tables were waiting for wine recommendations. Daniel forced himself to step away from the window. "I will be there shortly," he said, straightening his jacket again as he walked back into the dining room. Yet even while he spoke with guests and directed the staff, part of his attention remained fixed on the quiet question that had begun to trouble him. Who exactly was Clara Whitmore? Upstairs in the building lobby, Clara stepped out of the revolving door onto the polished stone floor of the reception hall. The tall ceiling echoed softly with the quiet hum of evening air conditioning, and the marble walls reflected the warm glow of recessed lights. The lobby desk attendant looked up immediately when she entered. "Good evening, Ms. Whitmore," he said respectfully. Clara returned the greeting with a small smile. "Good evening, Thomas." Ethan Caldwell stepped in behind her, carrying the leather briefcase carefully at his side. Thomas nodded politely toward him as well. "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell." The quiet exchange lasted only seconds, but it carried the comfortable familiarity of people who had worked together for years. Clara walked toward the bank of elevators, her footsteps soft against the polished floor. Ethan followed a respectful step behind. "Would you like to review the maintenance reports tonight as well?" he asked. Clara considered the question briefly before shaking her head. "Tomorrow morning will be fine. Tonight has already been unexpectedly interesting." Ethan allowed himself a small understanding smile. "Because of the restaurant?" Clara did not answer immediately. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime, and she stepped inside before turning slightly toward Ethan. "Let us simply say that people often make quick assumptions when they believe they understand their surroundings." Ethan nodded thoughtfully as the elevator doors closed and the car began its quiet ascent through the building. Meanwhile, downstairs in the Magnolia Room, Daniel Brooks had nearly convinced himself that he was overthinking the situation. Guests were laughing, glasses were clinking, and the evening continued smoothly just as it had every other night. Yet just as Daniel returned to the host stand, the front doors opened again. A middle-aged man wearing a tailored charcoal coat stepped inside, pausing just long enough to glance around the restaurant before approaching the stand with calm purpose. The hostess offered a polite greeting. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" The man shook his head slightly. "No reservation," he replied evenly. "I am looking for the manager." Daniel stepped forward immediately. "That would be me." The man extended his hand. "My name is Ethan Caldwell. I represent the property management office for this building." Daniel blinked once, not yet understanding why those words suddenly made the uneasy feeling in his chest return even stronger than before. Daniel Brooks hesitated only a fraction of a second before shaking Ethan Caldwell's hand, but the name and the introduction had already unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Property Management Office. The words echoed quietly in his mind as he studied the man standing in front of him. Ethan Caldwell carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who did not need to raise his voice in order to be taken seriously. His suit was impeccable, his expression composed, and the leather briefcase at his side suggested the kind of business conversations that rarely happened without preparation. Around them the Magnolia Room continued its refined evening atmosphere, but several nearby guests had begun to notice the exchange at the front stand. Daniel straightened slightly, returning to the professional tone he had used for years when speaking with building representatives. "Is there something I can assist you with, Mr. Caldwell?" he asked politely. Ethan gave a small nod. "I believe you may have already encountered the person I represent this evening." Daniel blinked once, a subtle reaction he could not quite hide. "I am not sure I understand," he replied carefully. Ethan rested one hand lightly on the edge of the host stand. "A few minutes ago a woman named Clara Whitmore entered the restaurant and spoke with you." The name seemed to land with unexpected weight. Daniel felt the quiet tension in his chest tighten slightly. "Yes," he admitted. "She stopped in briefly." Ethan watched him calmly, as though confirming a detail he had already expected. "I see." For a moment he said nothing further, allowing the silence between them to stretch just long enough to become noticeable. The hostess standing nearby shifted her weight nervously while pretending to organize the reservation list. Several diners at the closest table lowered their voices as they continued to watch. Daniel cleared his throat. "If there was a problem, I would be happy to address it," he said. Ethan's expression remained polite but thoughtful. "That is precisely why I came inside." Daniel felt the unease grow stronger now. "Did Ms. Whitmore request something?" he asked. Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Not exactly. Ms. Whitmore rarely requests things directly." Daniel frowned faintly at the phrasing. "Then I am not certain what this concerns." Ethan opened his briefcase slowly and removed a slim folder. He did not place it on the stand immediately. Instead he held it lightly in one hand while looking at Daniel with quiet patience. "Tell me, Mr. Brooks," he said calmly, "how long have you managed this restaurant?" "Nearly 15 years, Daniel answered, his voice steady though the question felt oddly personal. Ethan nodded as though acknowledging the accomplishment. "Then you must be very familiar with the building itself." Daniel hesitated again. "Familiar enough," he said cautiously. Ethan glanced briefly toward the tall windows that looked out onto the avenue, then back at Daniel. "This property has housed many businesses over the decades," he continued. "Restaurants, offices, galleries, even a small theater many years ago." Daniel waited, unsure where the conversation was heading. Ethan finally placed the folder gently on the stand and opened it so the first page faced Daniel. The document contained several official property forms and a letter bearing the building's management seal. Daniel's eyes moved across the page slowly until they reached a name printed near the top. Clara Whitmore. He looked back up immediately. Ethan spoke quietly, but every word was clear. "Ms. Whitmore asked me to confirm something very simple this evening." Daniel felt the room around him grow strangely quiet. "And what is that?" Ethan folded his hands calmly over the open folder. "Whether the tenants in this building truly understand who they are doing business with." For several seconds Daniel Brooks did not speak. His eyes remained fixed on the open folder resting on the host stand as though the printed name inside it had suddenly changed the meaning of everything that had happened earlier that evening. Around him the Magnolia Room continued its quiet symphony of clinking glasses and soft conversation, yet the small area near the entrance had grown noticeably still. Even the hostess beside him had stopped pretending to organize the reservation screen. Ethan Caldwell watched calmly, giving Daniel the time he needed to process what he was seeing. Finally Daniel lifted his eyes again. "I am afraid I still do not understand," he said carefully, though the uncertainty in his voice was now impossible to hide. Ethan's expression remained polite but steady. "It is actually very simple," he replied. The woman who visited a few minutes ago is Ms. Clara Whitmore. She is the primary owner of this building. The words seemed to settle into the air like a quiet weight. Daniel stared at him for a moment, waiting for the sentence to continue. But Ethan said nothing more. The statement itself was apparently meant to be enough. The owner? Daniel repeated slowly. Ethan gave a small confirming nod. Yes. Ms. Whitmore purchased the property nearly 12 years ago through a preservation trust. Since then she has overseen every renovation, every lease agreement, and every tenant partnership inside this structure. Daniel felt the floor beneath him seemed strangely less steady than it had a moment ago. His mind moved quickly back through the last 10 minutes, replaying every word he had spoken to Clara Whitmore at the entrance. The polite refusal. The suggestion that another establishment might suit her better. The confident assumption that she did not belong. Ethan continued calmly, as though explaining a simple business detail. Most tenants rarely meet her directly. Ms. Whitmore prefers to keep a low profile. She believes businesses should succeed based on their own merit rather than their connection to ownership. Daniel glanced toward the dining room instinctively, suddenly aware that several nearby guests had gone quiet enough to hear the conversation. The hostess stood perfectly still beside him. And tonight? Daniel asked, his voice noticeably softer now. Ethan closed the folder gently but left it resting on the stand. Tonight she stopped by because we were reviewing several property matters this week. Lease renewals, structural improvements, long-term planning for the building. He paused slightly before continuing. That includes the restaurant occupying the ground floor. Daniel swallowed quietly. The words lease renewal seemed to echo in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. I see, he managed to say. Ethan studied him for a moment before speaking again. Ms. Whitmore did not ask me to file any complaint. In fact, she said very little about the interaction inside. Daniel blinked in surprise. She did not. No, Ethan replied. She simply asked me to come in and observe the management environment here. Daniel felt the meaning behind those words immediately. Observe, he repeated. Ethan nodded slightly. She believes the character of a business can often be understood in the way it treats people it assumes are unimportant. Daniel could not find an answer to that. Through the tall front windows he could see the quiet street outside where Clara Whitmore had stood only minutes earlier. Somewhere above them, inside the tower she owned, she was likely continuing her evening without giving the situation another thought. Meanwhile the realization was only beginning to settle over Daniel Brooks that the woman he had dismissed so easily was the one person in the entire city whose opinion about his restaurant mattered more than anyone else in the room. Daniel Brooks remained standing at the host stand long after Ethan Caldwell closed the folder and stepped back slightly, giving the manager space to absorb the weight of what had just been explained. The Magnolia Room had not stopped operating. Waiters still carried plates across the polished floor, guests continued their quiet conversations, and soft music drifted through the dining room exactly as it had all evening. Yet the atmosphere near the entrance felt different now. The hostess glanced from Daniel to Ethan with wide, uncertain eyes, while several nearby diners pretended to focus on their meals even though it was clear they were listening. Daniel cleared his throat slowly. For the first time in many years of managing elegant restaurants, he found himself without the confident response he normally delivered so easily. His mind replayed the moment at the door when Clara Whitmore had calmly asked for a table and he had decided within seconds that she did not belong. The memory now felt painfully clear. I was not aware of her position, Daniel finally said, choosing his words carefully. Ethan gave a small nod that neither criticized nor excused the statement. Most people are not, he replied. Ms. Whitmore prefers it that way. Daniel looked down briefly at the polished wood of the host stand before speaking again. I may have made an incorrect assumption. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead he glanced around the dining room, observing the carefully arranged tables, the attentive staff, and the steady flow of business that filled the restaurant with quiet confidence. This is a successful establishment, he said calmly. The building benefits from having respected tenants. Daniel understood the meaning behind the sentence. Tenants, not owners. Is she planning to terminate the lease? Daniel asked quietly. Ethan shook his head once. Ms. Whitmore has made no such decision. Daniel felt a small breath leave his chest, though the tension did not fully disappear. Ethan continued. However, she does review every renewal personally. She believes that the businesses operating in her building should reflect the values she wishes to preserve. Daniel nodded slowly. Through the tall windows he could see the dark reflection of the city outside and the faint outline of the tower rising above the restaurant. Somewhere up there Clara Whitmore was likely continuing her evening in quiet privacy, far removed from the moment that had unsettled him so deeply. Ethan picked up the folder and closed his briefcase. She asked me to share only one message before I leave, he said. Daniel looked up. What message? Ethan met his eyes calmly. She said that buildings, like businesses, are defined by the way people inside them treat others. Especially when they believe no one important is watching. The words lingered in the air between them. Daniel felt their meaning settle heavily in his mind. For years he had believed that maintaining a restaurant's reputation meant carefully controlling appearances and judging who belonged inside. Now he realized that the one person whose judgment mattered most had been standing right in front of him while he dismissed her without a second thought. Ethan gave a polite nod. Good evening, Mr. Brooks. He turned and walked calmly toward the exit, leaving the quiet lesson behind him like a mirror Daniel could not avoid facing. For a long moment Daniel Brooks stood motionless at the entrance of the Magnolia Room. The laughter of diners returned, glasses clinked softly again, and the evening continued exactly as it had before. Yet something inside him had shifted. Because that night he finally understood that respect in a place of elegance is not proven by the price of the menu or the appearance of the guests, but by the humility of the people who welcome them. And in that realization, the entire room seemed to grow just a little quieter.